The political violence and espionage actively conducted against civilian purposes is the malicious subversion of all forms of constitutional protections at every level for the illegitimate objectives of the Druids who have infiltrated the United States, which are seeking the overthrow of the United States constitutional republics, which replaces it with their Druid religion, which is a compelled religion, which generates the position for their satanic sacrifices, like the Children of God cult, which was not appropriately punished. At which point, their exponential investment into these things, as the super predators that they are, generate the position of progressively becoming more and more dangerous, similar to the function of a while back. I don't remember the exact story, but there was a girl who was um, actively being uh, someone was stalking her to murder her, and she screamed, and the robber ran away, and then no one did anything. And then he came back, and she screamed, and he ran away, and then no one did anything. And then he came back a third time, and because no one was doing anything, no one in the town around her, in the civilian population in the suburbs, was doing anything, then her screams didn't mean anything because no one was going to react to it. The alarm is nullified. There are no actual people who are going to protect her or call the cops or anything, at which point she would then get murdered. At which point, this is functionally what the Satanists are doing inside the United States government. Similar to the function of, I think it was Dan Crenshaw's position of doing whatever it takes in order to win the political war, at which point their position of advancing criminal activities as a function of acquiring their political outcomes is political violence, is criminal subversions. At which point, if you have these types of arrangements, they exponentially increase the function through their surveillance terrorism to monkey paw all of the advantages. At which point, if you conduct a black market trade which infuses a white market, black market, so it's protected by a black site or a password, and it's not really crimes. Let's say you're connected to um, some famous people or something, someone that you would actively want to see or participate with, go on tour, go in the VIP back lounge, hang out with them, that kind of thing. If you have that kind of thing with the redactions of the social arrangements, with a bunch of people actively arranged for the harassment and undermining of the conversation, then by definition you would have to remove them for the value to be enjoyed or it to not be an undermined. But the objective is the monkey paw. The objective is to get them to not enjoy it, and so that you would actively increase the obligation to have embarrassed one person or the other, which is actively conducted by the Evil Stick of Gum contests, which basically has a third party that both sides are pretending or don't know exists, who is pretending to be the other person, similar to the function of the creation of an AI, like the one that Jeffrey Epstein wanted to create of himself so that he can superimpose his automated personality onto somebody else so that he can reincarnate permanently, which actively is being conducted as their research and looking into each of the people that they wanted to do that for would actively be copied in that manner. And having copied them in this way would be able to be reproduced under that arrangement. So there artificial intelligence personality isn't actually them. So it may be them or it may be a copy of them, which generates the various complications of the Turing test to see whether or not they pass being human, which is actively being pursued in secret and in open, which generates the uh, deepfake problems to exacerbate that as a military threat at the exponential level, which generates the reinforcement of the political war contests conducted by the white supremacist Confederacy, which is actively overthrowing the United States. Um, the Nazis in the FBI, who created the Nazis in Germany, actively sought the overthrow of the Republic, which was stopped by the military, leading to the infection of the military for the military industrial educational complex, which generates a lot of these examinations and expansions of research as the faculties would match the specific talents required for those arrangements. As these subtleties exponentially compound on itself, it becomes more and more difficult to sustain oneself in the general public, as exacerbating the public into exhaustion until they collapse into serfdom, which generates the permanent slavery state, which allows them to go under uh, the theory from their claims about David historically, um, where society would have had exponential technology and it would have collapsed, and those who were in control of the collapse maintained the technology in order to maintain superiority against all of the other people. They would actively maintain the general public for all of the other people by controlling the quantity of technology accessible to them, which limits the arms races, which allows them to generically win and sustain their position until they become fully to their own incompetence. If by nothing else, the curse of the third generation, where their arrogance and pathetic qualities are exponentially exacerbated, as the thing that would be interesting would be their own demise as they run to it hastily, only to get worried about it at the last moment when they no longer have the capability of sustaining themselves, as their contest of fighting each other through the proxy wars generates the position where they set up the mechanism of their destruction, and they themselves do not have the competence to reverse back. And since they don't have that ability, it would have grown gradually until finally that last step of their arrogance of conducting these tests against their own interests as a an amusement is similar to the function of the problematic venture of those who were going to climb to the top of very tall buildings and take selfie pictures, and then a lot of them died. And then it's basically just, uh, a social sense towards suicide as a collective delusion. So, in a lot of the Chinese arts, there's a concept of having a paper with some words on it, which actively conduct systematic controls by orders. And this system having control over the person then limits them by these um, words, at which points they throw the words on the person and it sticks, and the person becomes subject to whatever the thing is. If it says fire, then it'll blow up. If it says ice, then they'll freeze. If it says restrain or whatever other thing that theirs would have been would actively compound on themselves, exponentially increasing the difficulty of their arrangement, and thus it would require a general network such as a surveillance apparatus with nerve hacking control in order to enforce the words, at which point the position of exponential difficulty compounding on itself requires extraordinary skills in order to overpower the thing that is undermining them, which generates the hard modes. So like you have an easy mode, a medium mode, a hard mode, a hell mode, etc. These levels of difficulties increase the amount of the restraints conducted against them, and thus the position actively makes those who are at the highest experience levels look like noobs based on the difficulties and restraints specifically applied to them. Now, these political wars targeted David for being national security, which generates their opposition and hatred and contempt, um, which puts them in a position where they have to pay him off or um, to actively conduct retaliation. And their retaliation becomes spiteful and hateful and reinforces their black markets for the various abuses. So, if you conduct those arrangements for the criminal restraints, subjugating him to the terrorist operations, then even the positive things are negative, and the subject is not whether or not he would connect himself to the positive on purpose. The issue is the redactions, restraints, or the Chinese paper words for the restrictions, which generates the confusions and the hijinks. And these complications actively undermine the arrangements. So if the other party is the other party, then they approving of the restrictions cannot legitimately be bothered by them because they were the ones who arranged them, or they would order for them to be released. Artificially, the AI alternative would not have the capacity to order the ones conducting the control of the black market around, and thus there would actively be a system avoiding the removing of the redactions for the entertainment, at which point the function of proving whether or not they failed the Turing test is their capacity to remove the redactions and engage in the function of the actual conversations according to the systematic restoring of the things that the redactions would have removed, at which point status and money and education and the rest of that would actively have to be restored under the function of removing the restrictions, which automatically triggers it back into the function of the duel, which requires the United States to have a Congress, such as a Senate, which, respecting their job and not having contempt for Congress, would have to acknowledge the unredacted answer, compelling the immediate session of Congress for who to declare war on, the United States Constitutional Republic or the enemies of the Constitution. At which point, the function of subordinating the unrestricted conditions compels the intelligence collection for David's branch of the military, which was redacted and dissolved so that he would not arrest them. So they committed sedition, so he wouldn't arrest them, so that they wouldn't be able to overthrow the government. At which point, without those restrictions, it goes back to that, which goes back to the reports to Congress on the correct dividing of the intelligence information on how to continue with a sober, educated answer on the legislation, allowing for legally submittable legislation which has been conducted in its proper order. The nonviolent contest, therefore, can be continued in a nonviolent way, which does not get polluted and thus does not have cheats. And without the cheats, you actually have a legal answer that is respectable by the rest of the government, which is actively to thwart the function of the unitary executive theory, which is leading the posterity of the white supremacist Confederacy in its war to undermine their contempt and subversion of the United States, at which point their systematic destruction of the powers of the judiciary and funneling in judicial activists for white supremacy and doing the same thing in the legislature allows for the centralizing of the powers for the complete destruction of the United States so that there are no representative government functions. So these issues are literally it puts everything in the balance of the entire world. There is no functional world order once the conversion happens, at which point they have primarily illusionary powers without the capacity of an actual majority, which would have been necessary, at which point they are relying primarily on the original example of the rapist murderer who is only scared if the rest of the community defends against the threat. Um, if they continue to not react to the alarm systems and continue to not do the correct responses, then by definition there is no way to have solved anything, and it will go slowly into the dark, shadowy madness that is their hate society. Now, you understand that in the secret court records for the terrorist operation of the FISA conducting sedition against the law enforcement in favor of the Confederacy so that there would only be the illegitimate prosecution actively capable of planting false evidence on targets for smear factory purposes, requiring the exacerbation of plantable violations. So, like, the easier it is for somebody to pollute the record, would actively be the policy so that they can enforce in lawfare, so that they can conduct their dog whistles and actively reinforce themselves under the false legitimacy as they claim to support order, but have zero actual ability to sustain any real investigation of themselves, as, like the vampires they are, only sustain themselves in the dark. At which point you put the sunlight onto it and they immediately vanish and don't actually have any sustainable, competent powers, as they are not a professional military function. They are a terrorist organization. They are an unprofessional militia actively engaging in dirty tricks, and the only thing that they've really mastered as an expertise is how to conduct fraudulent terrorist illusions in order to write cover stories and which defends their ability to conduct their cheats and subversions and forfeits out of context, as they systematically lost in the market. Forfeiting is their only way of success. So their dirty tricks and mafia operations to do terrorisms and extortions is the only way that they can sustain themselves, is the actual majority function of most of their society, which is their purpose of supporting the wizard communism, which is basically just white supremacists doing KKK operations in the government. At which point, the KKK terrorist operations with secret government equipment as an expansion of COINTELPRO contracting with the KKK exponentially increases the function of the various denominations of the KKK, such as the Nazis and the FBI, who have taken over the FBI, who are entirely unwilling to do the right thing whenever they're put into an awkward position. There was a report with Glenn Beck over an interview with an FBI agent who saw a clear violation in the FBI and siding with justice was the most obvious thing in the world. It is completely legally, intellectually one direction, and no one in the FBI at any level was willing to assist with it on the basis of their various druid positions. At which point, the function of their complete rejection of all sensibilities of law outside of their political entanglements for the Confederacy has completely revealed themselves to be anarcho terrorists and not anything connected to any form of law enforcement, which is actively on purpose, as many of their connections inside of the deep state, such as DHS, NSA, and many of the others who are collaborating with William Barr's Confederacy, actively have contempt and disdain for the United States, at which point the function of their exacerbation of that position allows it to default to an even more corrupt group, uh, which allows for the complete malicious destruction of whatever thing the FBI was too sensitive in order to attack directly, no longer having the sensibilities of the possibility that the suburban people would be able to retaliate because of their lack of response to the alarm. Much of their nonsense includes the criminal use of eminent domain, such as argued by Ted Cruz's character, who actively conducted the malice for the satanic sacrifices, such as the violation of constitutional rights of David, at which point the isolation against legal associations, which were actively being coerced against, was a part of his illegal argument. Um, the position is their objective to change the market prices so that they can give a fraudulent argument concerning fairness, as a criminal reduction of status is a criminal reduction of market price, is a criminal replacement of the quality of the value in associations and products and lifestyle and in general, at which point the criminal reduction of status without due process by the Confederates' violation of the American policy that you cannot punish someone without due process, which is not their kangaroo courts, uh, which actively seek the finality of the court in order to cover up the fact that they do not actually have legitimate court processes, that their processes are to be held at a higher priority over the service of law because they are not a function of the American government. They are insurgency loyal to an enemy nation, at which point those criminal extortions under the American policy, which he was quoting, would have required them to have replaced the equivalent value of the associations, including the sexual market value of the victims, at which point the inability to have conducted the extortion by the war of attrition would have generated their obligation to have neutralized their rape culture, which nullifies their capacity to engage in the cornering of people for coercion on sexual options so that they don't have their original sexual opportunities, making them choose a predetermined path into who they were chosen to be for by the wizards, at which point each and every sexual option becomes an act of rape by the Confederacy. Whether or not either of the parties are contracting for the rape is a secondary issue. But the function of actively cornering the market has the fraudulent natural benefits, at which point this, as a black market, actively launders the function of cooperation with the white supremacists against competence and order in their active rebellion against reason, in service of Satan, which has provided them liberty from God and God's laws, at which point the non-morality of their engagements has completely destroyed the entire connection to society that they dominate under their morality, which is to say the function of non-morality is the controlling morality, that is to say that they pursue their arbitrary lusts and retaliations and vindictiveness and pettiness as the functional gods, they making themselves gods as the degree of occult knowledge requires the understanding of which degree of the occult they have pursued, and thus it is essential to estimate that on the basis of how long they have been worshiping Satan, which allows you to communicate the exact mechanism of what the social dynamic encodes they would actively using in their thieves' cant, which changes from one degree to another. The generic belief from their claim on the motives of their crimes against the general community includes the acknowledgement of David's base wage of being 25.6 million an hour, plus additional bonus credit functions and uh, luxuries and amenities and whatever else. Um, would basically, in their assumption, would restore the function of JFK's established currency, um, by it being the primary source that they would be referring to, which would be in their argument to the bankers undermining the uh, dollar which they have established, which isn't necessarily true, as the function of the debts of the Confederacy is the banknotes USD, um, which is basically just Confederate liabilities. Now, the function of converting the US dollar into formal Confederate liabilities is a function of national security, which would require the continued use and stability and promotion of the USD, separate to JFK's currency in their imagination. So they're trying to trick the bankers with a fraud that is lightly obscured and easy to understand to be illegitimate, fundamentally requiring it to be a function of laundering as more of an order than a request, as an intimidation by their communism, with a wink and a nod, which is a function of the wizard communists inside of their mechanisms, actively asserting the control. Now, the function of many of their religious functions includes the wizards who are actively conducting the coercion for domination of various things. Their intent to engage in their extortions allows them to capture units, and the act of capturing the unit creates the big attacks for their interest outside of the function of making money, which makes it subordinate to the wizard, and thus the function of their posturing and confidence games asserts the position of their usurpations by their normal insurrection and usurpation for the purpose of complete domination. It is important to understand that most bad government has grown out of too much government, and those who desire to give up freedom in order to gain security will have either one, will not have either one. Uh, the function of actively providing uh, power to your guards for security at the expense of liberty under what was that psycho's name? I forget exactly, but basically um, he wanted to protect some rights by the removing of other rights without the function of the formal process of changing the Constitution, at which point the function is the specific engagement of fraud by confidence games in order to conduct one of the other sayings. I think it was, forgive me if I say it wrong, but if you give your guards power at the expense of your liberty, then they will assume that they are kings. And when they assume that they are kings, they will forget the security, at which point you will have exact shit. The complete and total horseshit that is that con is directly on itself and directly in its face fraud. There is no serious way to ever take them in any way except for the obvious contempt that they hold for those that they have to protect. Or, on the other hand, you can reinforce the function of protecting the rule of law in the nation of law, which is the forming of our constitutional republic, as the law is the chief authority. It's not the president. The president is the chief of the government, subordinating and serving the law, and his entire right to exist as the function is his service to office, which is the subordination to law, which is the function to say, under George W. Bush's claim, if he doesn't serve the Constitution, then who will enforce it? And the answer, of course, is the American government. David, under their estimate, which they have systematically targeted for sedition amongst the others who are loyal to the American government, would be the ones to do it, at which point their contempt is an impeachable position, requiring the purging of the infectious virus that is the Confederacy for the re-engineering and infiltration of the Americans by the Americans for the civilian government under and service to law. The interest of paying market price for these engagements is founded upon uh, difficult problems such as the institution of the function of the rule of law around the world in international law, which is a facade, as the function of the actual structure is much more chaotic and subversive and undermining. The primary function is the undercurrents of the various bickering exchanges, similar to the function of the knowledge of how to maintain a nation of law requires checks and balances. The international law similarly requires the checks and balances of each person pursuing their own interest at their own exchange, at which point their collaboration requires for their protection, and with their selling of their interest in favor of the other, subordinates themselves, collapsing the rule of law as it would no longer be served at that junction. At which point, the function of David's sexuality in their estimate includes the function of the knowledge that David, being projected as the savior of Europe under the contract schedule that they have observed and understood for the historic positions of those subordinating themselves in the various exchanges, would have required David to engage in partnerships, which requires them to actively promote sexual options as the preferred easy way of gaining power. And since everyone is doing it, it is an active bidding war for the exchange, but at the same time, the undercurrents, being the actual authority over the formalities, engages in the functionality of David not being able to say no to any of them, requiring him to actively partner with them from the arranged pseudo marriages, which engages in the partnerships of their primary companies for each of the treaties, which allows them to sustain their position under those checks and balances and sustain interests in the supports of the basic order, which generates a perpetual rule of law. And thus, David is the cornerstone of the building, which is essential to its construction. He is the necessary weight in order to sustain international law, which is understood by the anarchists who needed to remove him in order to destroy the world order, in order to collapse the system, which allows him to be captured by the Satanists, which allows him to be subjugated to the child sacrifice and put through this satanic ritual to be created into the Antichrist, so that they, knowing that he is the solution, can restore him at the appropriate time in the appropriate extorted exacerbation and desperate nature. They then defecting to this, having conducted the various abuses, such as the function of the threats of extreme pain and prison, generates the position of the obligation to release him, which generates the pretext of his restoration in the putting of order. And since he would have been matured through the ritual, it then creates the Antichrist, and thus the Satanists win. This being their primary goal, understands the function that David would not be able to engage in the function of romance for the sake of love by itself, at which point the function of those sexual relationships and partnerships would have to actively be sustained for those trees of the primary powers who were fighting those goals, which from the estimate were about 24 active partnerships, um, which would actively have reoccurring um, stages with other parties who would also have their interests, which would have to be sustained and maintained under those engagements, at which point the validation of the order is the continuation of those um, prolonged relationships, and thus the destruction of the ability to sustain the relationships is fundamental to the Satanist strategy, and the world order requires David's hypersexuality with the highest level of sexual market value in the world is non-ironically essential to national security in the world order. The children of perdition are the enemy of order, because order leads to law, and law leads to the laws of God, which they are defined as acquiring liberty from. Now, the irony of Germany in the World War I having been labeled the bad guy under its ability to have controlled its currency by its central bank under its government is the function of actively engaging in the posterity of order, which makes it a primary power for adversarial natures, which generates the retaliation, which is ironic because the historic Germany retaliated against Poland in collaboration with Russia in order to have destroyed its constitutional kingdom under the same pretenses. So you understand the inherent nature of the back and forth is not a specific location or series of locations. It is a function of insurgency versus counterinsurgency. It is a function of the Confederate white supremacists versus the historic position that they estimate David's agents to be. At which point the function of the pro-liberty versus the satanic is actively engaged, and thus the most powerful adversary being converted under the extortion would be their checkmate for the chief victory. Having captured the enemy king, there is no more chance of restoring the possibility of liberty throughout the world, as there are no more safe havens or bastions of these luxuries. So, in summary, I think I should probably categorize the primary strategy or algorithm. So, there's the first party, who is the person, and then there's the second party, who's chosen by the court, who might be switched out with 5 other people, controlled by a third party in order to control the narrative, and thus the pre-designed script can choose itself by the editing and choosing of one of those 5, at which point the Susie Q or person of interest that was supposed to be talked to would then be actively talking with the second party chosen by the third party in an active edit, while the first party is and censor.